Oh. Okay, so as you guys know, we are continuing the series that we've been doing on Bible and world history. And this is the fourth lesson. And we're going to be, the first one we covered like all of prehistory. And so it feels like less today, but there's still so much. Today, we're going to be covering 300 years of world history from 1400 BC to 1100 BC, which in Bible terms is three books of the Bible. It's Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. And the story of Ruth actually happens right in the time of the Judges. And I know that because it's the first sentence of the book. It says, in the time of the Judges, there was a woman, and then it tells the story. So that's pretty easy. I didn't need like my chronological Bible to tell me that. But before we get into that, just a reminder, because I know people are in different spaces spiritually. And if people are watching this later on YouTube, I just want to kind of put some caveats out there that this is definitely coming from a Christian perspective. And I'm working under the presumption that the Bible tells the truth. It doesn't mean that everything in the Bible is literally something that happened, but that everything in the Bible is truthful and trustworthy, maybe is a better word. And then all of the information I'm getting is from various texts. It's from Epic Archaeology. It's from Google. It's from my chronological Bible, listening to podcasts, all kinds of neat stuff. So if you hear something that you're like, I don't like that, or I want to know more about that, holler at me, because there's probably a podcast I can send you to, or a book I can send you to, or an article or whatever. Okay. Where we find ourselves in the timeline is actually the beginning of the collapse of the Bronze Age and the entrance into the Iron Age. Very exciting. I did not realize until I was putting this lesson together that it's not a clean exit and then start. It's not like Bronze Age ends, Iron Age begins. The Iron Age probably starts in the sort of second part of our lesson tonight during the book of Judges, but the Bronze Age kind of continues on, but it's waning and collapsing. A little bit of what's happening in the world before we get to the Bible. Starting at 1400 BC and those next 300 years. In Egypt, Thebes is the capital. It becomes the largest city in the whole world, taking the lead from Memphis. Not Memphis, Georgia. That didn't exist yet. But surprisingly, there was around this time, some stuff happening in North America. In the Western Hemisphere, speaking of the devil, if you remember, I told you about the Norte Chico people. They were on the coast of Peru. And but that civilization collapsed, sadly. And then several large centralized civilizations developed in parts of modern day Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, Colombia, Dominican Republic, Guatemala, and Mexico. And the biggest one was in Mexico, the Olmec civilization, which you may have heard of. And in all of these, I'm not going to list all of the tribes of people, Aztec, Incan, all these kind of things, but you can go look that up on Wikipedia. But the Olmec civilization was the first Mesoamerican civilization. It actually started a little bit before tonight's timeline, but it continued through 400 BC. So really strong. And that's what becomes modern day Mexico. We've got the beginning of the Mycenaean era. That's in the Greece part of the world. The center of like political and cultural power in the Aegean has now shifted from Crete to mainland Greece. And they have some pretty wealthy warrior kings. Greece will be a major player on the scene when we get to the New Testament, but right now they're still sort of building up. Over in China, we find ourselves smack in the middle of the Shang dynasty. The Shang dynasty included 30 kings and lasted 6 centuries. Interestingly enough, they didn't go from like father to son. They went often from older brother to younger brother. Like they're really keeping it in the family and rapid succession. They practiced a form of ancestor worship, and they also worshiped the Shang-Ti, which is a god who ruled over the lesser gods of the sun, moon, wind, and rain. You're not going to hear me talk too much in the future about Western civilization because they weren't really involved with our story. I mean, they're doing their own things. They're having their own wars. They're having their own survival and building up cities and things like that. But because our story, as you know, has zoomed into the family of Abraham and then the people of Israel, the Israelites, anyone that's going to be messing with the Israelites is going to be around there. So it's going to be in the Near East. But okay, so that's what's happening in the world. Part one of what we're talking about tonight is the book of Joshua. Joshua is so if you remember from last time, the people were in the wilderness a really long time. They had to stay there and wait till the next generation came up. And so we find ourselves on the precipice, excuse me, of the promised land. And God has promised them that they're going to come in. He said, I'm going to take care of it. I'm going to go ahead of you. This land is yours. It's going to be flowing with milk and honey and all this promise and blah, blah, blah. And so they enter the land and they start defeating it. And there's Joshua is like the first half of it is really about the conquest of Canaan, which would become future, Israel and the area around that. I will say this, when they crossed, so the big deal was to cross the Jordan River, which is both literal and has cool symbolism. People even to this day will talk about when someone dies, they've crossed the Jordan because it means they've gone to heaven. When they crossed the Jordan River is not like the Red Sea where it was unpassable without God's help, but God did open it up in the same way that he did with the Red Sea. He moved the water so they could pass through on dry land. And I don't think it's because they like needed that miracle. It was just to be another like show of God's like display of God's purpose, right? This is where I want you to go and I'm paving the way for you. And when they cross over the Jordan and they know they're like technically in the promised land and they're about to take over, they set up, there's various words for this. You could say the word Ebenezer, which is a weird word, but it's in a song we sing. So now you know what it is. Stones of remembrance, memorial stones. You might call it not an altar. What's the other word I'm looking for? Doesn't matter. Point is, they took these giant 12 stones, one for each tribe, because remember, Jacob's sons were the 12 tribes of Judah. So like Joseph and Benjamin and Reuben and Judah and on it goes, right? So one for each of the tribes they put at this place. It's called Gilgal. It's called various things at various times. And I'm telling you that because it's going to come back into one of our stories hundreds of years later, which is kind of cool. So they get into the promised land and the first place they have to deal with is Jericho. And this is a story that if you grew up in the church, you heard the song about the Joshua fought the battle of Jericho and the walls came tumbling down and the horns and all that stuff. But before they get to that point, there is the story of Rahab. We've talked about this story before, so I'm not going to go into great detail. You can hearken back to that or you can ask me about it later. But Rahab is such a cool character. She is the first non-Israelite convert that's like all the way in. She's also one of the great grandmothers of Jesus. So she's in Jericho. She knows nothing about the Exodus and the Israelite connection and covenant with the Lord. And yet when the spies come in, excuse me, she says to them, so Rahab owns a brothel essentially on the wall of the city. The wall of the city would have like housing in it. And so she owned a brothel, which was very smart because, I mean, it's not a great line of work, but it was, strategic because Jericho was actually a military encampment. That comes into play later when you're worried about the violence in the Old Testament. So she has a brothel there. The spies come in, they've sort of been made and they go to her and they ask for help. And she says, she helps them and she hides them. And she says to them, I've heard of your God. We all have, we're melting in fear. And it's an interesting phrase because how did they hear about him? Like there's no social media, there's no newspapers. This is many miles away from Egypt. The only way they could have heard of him is that God went ahead of the Israelites and made his presence known in this way, like the real God and his people are coming through, like, watch out. And there was already some dispersal of the people just knowing that, right? This big army is coming and it wasn't the size of the army, it's because it had Yahweh behind it. Anyway, Rahab helps them. And then she says, but you have to save my family. And they say, okay. And then she marries one of the Israelites and their baby ends up being Jesus, which is very cool because she's like, big sinner from the non-Israelite tribe of, I don't even know who the Jerichoites, we'll call them. Okay, so they do the whole thing with Jericho where they go around the city and they blow the horns, the walls come tumbling down, they end up burning the city, defeating the people. A lot of the people have already left. But God has given them some clear instructions. God has said, go into these cities. I'm going to give them to you. I'm going to drive the people out. Most of the language in these chapters is about driving the people out of the land. It's not theirs. and that the Israelites get to have the land. It's not mostly about destruction. It's mostly about driving them out. But some people stay to fight. And so the armies fight and they win at Jericho. Then there's the next city, which is Ai. By the way, all three cities I'm going to talk about have been positively identified archaeologically with fallen walls, fortifications, burned grain in the late Bronze Age. Like this is all verified. I mean, it's not verified that happened the way the Bible says it does. We have to trust that part about the horns and everything, but that they were destroyed, that they existed at this time. Okay. So they get to Ai, and they're supposed to do the same thing. And one of the rules is you don't take anything from that city, any of it's called the devoted things. Some people think that means that like they're, artifacts that have spiritual significance, like idols and stuff. Sometimes people think that anything that's in that city is devoted to the Lord because it's supposed to be like an offering to the Lord that you take over the city. That's the Lord's. Now he's given it to you. But God told them not to take anything. And this one guy, there's like one of them in every classroom, his name was Achan, Achan. He took some stuff for his family. And because he did that, they lost the war at Ai. And they came back to their, encampment, those that survived, and they're like, what happened? Like, I thought God was going to send us in and win for us, but like we lost. And they discover that Achan did this. And I honestly would have to go back and read it, but to find out exactly what they did about that. But they went to the Lord and said, we're sorry, we won't do that again. They went back, they defeated Ai. Then they went up to Hazor and defeated that. Those are the three sort of big spots. And if you were to look at them on a map, they kind of go like doop, 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 up the strip of what is now Israel. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about the violence that occurred in the conquest, though it is a big question that people ask about. How can you serve or love a God that would even command that kind of violence? The only reason I'm not going to talk about it tonight is because it's one of the things I've studied in great depth and I've already taught on. So several of you have already heard me talk about this, and I don't want to make you listen to it again, but I also have a talk that I can send you to that you can listen to about it. There are also some really good books written about this. I don't think that the same kind of destruction that you hear about in the language actually happened. I think a lot of it is hyperbolic, the same way that when we win like a sports event, you say like, oh, we annihilated them, but it doesn't mean we killed them all. It means we won. And we know at least some of that's happening because the text will say something like, and they completely defeated the Amalekites. Then you turn like 2 pages in your Bible, it's like the Amalekite blah, blah, blah showed up. And you're like, wait, I thought they completely defeated them. But there they are again. That happens enough times that you're like, okay, what they mean is they won that battle, and they got that space or whatever. So if you have questions about that, holler at me later and I will talk to you about that. Then there's this cool story. It's the trick of the Gibeonites. By the way, there's a lot of ites in what we're talking about tonight. Oh, okay. The Gibeonites are a people that are supposed to be displaced and give their land over to the Israelites, but they hear about the Israelites ahead of time and they know that they don't stand a chance because God is on the side of the Israelites. So they trick the Israelites, and it's kind of crafty, and I kind of like it, even though, they lied. What they did is they got some very like tattered, old, nasty rags of clothes and made themselves all dirty and nasty. And they sent a few people over to the Israelite encampment and said, we're from this faraway place and we've heard about you guys. And we just want to say like, we're these lowly, like, nomads, and we won't mess with you at all, but like, please be nice to us and, let us stay where we are and don't, defeat us. And the Israelites are like, who are you again? They're like, oh, don't worry about it. We're from really far away. Well, anyway, this is the Sarah version. The Israelites, there's a line and it says like, they did not consult the Lord. It's like, so they got tricked and they make a covenant. This will let you know just how important covenants are in the Old Testament. This is how important people viewed covenants, because they made a covenant with the Gibeonites saying, fine, we won't defeat you. And then you fast forward a little bit and they find out the Gibeonites are right in their spot and that they had been tricked. But because of the covenant they made, they honored it and they never messed with them. They did make them like work for them, but they didn't kill any of them or drive any of them out. So good job, Gibeonites. Then there's a story about Joshua in a battle where God makes the sun stand still for a day. It's a story that a lot of skeptics have a problem with because it's like, well, that defies the laws of physics. The sun doesn't stand still. Of course, the question isn't, did the sun stand still, but did the earth stop rotating, or whatever the way is that God did it? The appearance to the people on the ground is that daylight lasted into the night. And so that's kind of a cool thing. I actually believe that happened. Many people don't, but I do. And then the second half of Joshua is pretty boring because it wasn't boring to them, but to us, it's the allotment of land to each of the different tribes. We're not going to really get into that because, I mean, I think I've just said all that we need to know about that. But there is a cool thing toward the end of Joshua about the cities of refuge. So God establishes these cities of refuge that are places where someone who had killed another person by accident. Remember, these are agrarian. I mean, they're farming and they're hunting and they're chopping things and they're burning things and they're building. I mean, it wasn't the world that we live in, right? And so if somebody killed somebody else by accident, in order to escape the quick revenge of the dead person's family, God is trying to stop the emergence of these blood feuds that were happening at the time. That person could stay in the city of refuge while the investigation took place. So it's sort of like being like on parole, you know. They could stay in the city of refuge. No one could mess with them. God set this up so that they could stay there. And then if it turned out like he didn't know that he was like plowing a field and, you know, I don't know what the thing would be, but so that's kind of cool. And I think it has some neat not only symbolism looking forward, but it also just lets us know that God is trying to help them be a more civilized people, you know, not as barbaric as they would be, where they'd have these blood feuds and then everybody's like family on family, the Hatfields and the McCoys kind of thing. And then the book of Joshua ends with Joshua giving this sort of farewell speech. And you've probably seen one of the phrases from this speech, like sometimes on people's doors or in their house. If you go to a home that has like the cutesy phrases where it says, choose you this day whom you will serve. As for me and my house, will serve the Lord. Basically, Joshua leaves the people. He knows he's dying. And so he gathers all the people and he just repeats all of the promises of God, says, please follow God's way. It did not go well for us when we didn't. It won't go well for you if you don't, but it will go so well for you if you do. Please choose that. And as for me and my house, that's what we're going to do. But as you can imagine, it doesn't quite go that way because people will always choose themselves. So Joshua dies, and the book of Joshua ends, and then we get to the book of Judges. This is in history. This is from about 1366 to 1051, late Bronze Age. And in the middle of the book of Judges is when the Iron Age begins. Iron Age begins about 1200 BC. So before I tell you about the book of Judges, a little bit about what's happening in the world there, and then I'm going to actually share my screen and show you some stuff. In Greece, we have the pre-classical period, which is where we get like the rise of the epic hero in Greek culture, possibly the historical basis for the Trojan War, which inspired Homer. That's where that occurred. Some scholars dispute that. There is some notable archaeology, especially in Egypt. This is the Amarna period. Does anybody know what that is? Once you start doing relearning world history, people will not shut up about the Amarna period and the Amarna letters. They're these, well, you know what? Let me share my screen and I'll show you. Oh, here we go. Sorry, I don't do this often enough to remember every time, so I always have to fumble my way through it. Okay. You guys can see the screen, right? Okay. Let's start here. So, and let me move you guys for YouTube later. So the Amarna letters, I mean, I'm just going to read this basically, but they're these clay tablets that are correspondence between Egypt and Canaan, with their leaders talking to each other about war and supplies and asking for help and things like that. They range from 1360 to 1332 BC. And there's a ton of information from these that really just helps scholars understand what was happening in that world as far as trade, and who's getting along with who. Interestingly enough, for our purposes, let's see, I'm going to skip down to where it's in bold. The Canaanite city-states were, this is something that's written in there, were seeking help from Egypt because they were being overrun by the Habiru. The Habiru is sort of disputed. Everyone knows that it's sort of this like outsider group. It literally means dusty or dirty. It's this term for like outsiders, rebels, slaves, day laborers. Some people think it means it's from this Hebrew word eber, which means other side, and maybe even talking about Abraham who crossed Canaan from the other side, but some people think that the word Hebrew comes from Habiru, Hebrew. The Hebrew people are more than just the Israelites, but the point is that in the Amarna letters, there is communication about these troublemakers coming into the land of Canaan, which we know is the promised land. And so it's like evidence in real archaeology that this was happening, right? That the Israelites were coming in and they were taking over this land. That's pretty cool. Another thing about this time that's notable archaeologically is the Merneptah stela. I for sure had to ask how to pronounce that last word. I was saying stele, but it's stela. It looks sort of like a headstone, but it's an inscription. If you look closely, you can see like all the little characters. It's currently in the, I just realized this says Egyptian. I think that needs to say Egyptian museum in Cairo. And it's an account of, that was one of the pharaohs. It was an account of his victory over the Libyans, but there are 3 lines in it that deal with a separate campaign in Canaan. And so it represents actually the earliest extra biblical, meaning something that's not in the Bible, reference to the Israelites. There's a lot more that I could say about that. If you go to the Wikipedia page, it's pretty cool. Or if you type in like what it has to do with the Bible, because Israel wasn't really like a name on the world stage, and yet they're mentioned here. So it's like they weren't a city state yet, so they wouldn't have been mentioned unless there was something happening. It wouldn't be like the way that they might mention I'm trying to remember what Babylon at that point was called, but Babylon or, Samaria or something like that. Okay, let's stop sharing and go back to my Word document. So that's what's happening there. In the Bible, the book of Judges is actually one of my favorite books of the Bible because, one, it has really cool stories in it. Stories that maybe some of them you heard when you were little. And I'm not going to go into super big detail on any of them because we're going to try to spend most of our time in our discussion. But the pattern that happens in Judges is so like you watch it happen and you just like you cover your eyes and you're like, why, Israelites, why? But it's the same thing we do to this day. The pattern goes something like this. Everything is going smoothly. Then the people of God decide to do things their own way. And there's a line in Judges that's in there so many times. I didn't count it, but it's like everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Everyone did. It just keeps saying it, meaning they were not doing what Joshua implored them to do, which is to follow God and do things God's way. And so they start doing things like intermarrying with the tribes, like the Midianites and the Philistines and the Moabites and all these kind of people that God had said, don't do that, because it's not because there's something yucky about them as like an ethnicity, but they're going to get you involved in idolatry. They're going to convince you to follow their gods. And then you're going to do the really terrible thing that their quote gods ask you to do, things like child sacrifice and cannibalism and super gross things like that. God is trying to say, like, I'm taking you to a place where we have cities of refuge, and I'm taking you to a place where instead of killing a guy because you lost a finger, how about finger for finger, hand for hand, tooth for tooth, that kind of thing. I'm going to set things up to protect women. I'm going to set things up in a way that your civilization will work really well. But when you involve yourself with people that have given themselves over to these brutal, violent gods, which are involved in basically demon worship, then that's going to influence you, and it's going to be the downfall of you. And honestly, it's the downfall of so many people in the Bible. So that's what the people do. They go their own way. They find the pretty women from the other spots and they intermarry. And then God says, fine, you don't want to do things my way. That's fine. You don't want to have me around telling you what to do. I won't be around. I will just like back off, remove my protection just enough that you'll see what it's like to not, to not have my protection. And so then they will get taken over by, or oppressed by, or enslaved by one of these neighboring tribes. So they disobey God. God gives them over to what they want. Then they're enslaved. Sometimes the people will come in and hurt them. Sometimes they'll enslave them. Sometimes they'll just steal their stuff, extortion, all that kind of jazz. Then the people are like, what have we done? We're really sorry. They cry out to the Lord, and the Lord sends them a deliverer, which in the book of Judges, that's what judge really means. It means a savior or a deliverer, someone that's going to pull them out of this mess. And then there's peace in the land. And it'll say after every story, there's a pattern. Like you can watch this in Judges, like rinse, repeat. Here we go every time. And then it'll say there was peace in the land for 20 years. There was peace in the land for 40 years, whatever the thing is. And then everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And then it goes right back in. And so the judges are a very unlikely brood of people for this, what is it, like 200, 300 years that God uses. They are not good people, y'all. They are real flawed. I was going to use another word, but this is going on YouTube and my mom might watch. So they're very flawed people who make really poor decisions, but God uses them nonetheless. And a lot of times you see phrases like, and the Spirit of the Lord fell upon Samson, or the Spirit of the Lord fell upon Gideon, or whatever. And then they were able to do these things. So it's like God used these people that couldn't do anything on their own, but because of God could help the people get out from under the clutches of these neighboring tribes for a while. So I'm not going to talk about each of them. There's a guy named Othniel. Then we get to Ehud. Ehud is the one who, if you guys remember, does anyone remember the story of killing the really fat king Eglon, where the sword went into his stomach and they had to leave it there? Because he was very fat. That story, remember earlier I told you about the 12 rocks that they took out of the Jordan and made like an Ebenezer or stones of remembrance. So you fast forward, you're probably what, like 150, 200 years later now. And Ehud is tasked with going and killing the king of the Moabites. Moabites were bad. We're going to hear about them later in the story of Ruth. Ruth is a Moabite. Ugh, spoiler. Ehud is supposed to kill Eglon. You can remember because Eglon just sounds like a fat name. And Ehud gets there and wimps out. And he is afraid. He's like, I can't do it. So he leaves. And when he's walking back, or maybe riding a horse, whatever, he passes the stones of remembrance. And it's just this almost throwaway verse in the Bible that if you were just reading it the first time, you would have no idea. It'd be like, and he passed the stones at Gilgal and then blah, blah, blah. But if you know that the stones of Gilgal are when God was saying, put these here because later you're going to want to remember my faithfulness, then you realize that what happened is he saw the stones and was like, oh yeah, God fights our battles for us. God clears the way for us. God makes space for us to cross the Jordan, to come into the promised land, all the things that my father told me and my father's father. And so he goes back and he gets the job done. I love that story because I think it just resonates with so many of us that we wimp out. We don't want to do what we're supposed to do. And then we get a moment where we're like, we remember God's faithfulness from before. And we're like, okay, I remember now I'm trusting in God's strength, not mine. Anyway, okay. Then we get Shamgar. Poor guy only gets one sentence in the Bible. And I happen to have it memorized because my intramural volleyball team in college that I was the captain of, not because I was good at volleyball, but because I was organized, was the judges. And our little tagline was order in the court. Get it? So cute. And my jersey said Shamgar. So it's Shamgar killed 600 Philistines with an ox goad. That's all it says about Shamgar. Guess that's all it took. Then we get the story of Deborah, which we've talked about here. Deborah is a female judge, pretty cool. And she was actually doing some actual judging as well. Before she delivered people, she was actually settling disputes like legally. And then there's a story of her and this male military leader who she said, can you go and take care of this other military army that God's going to help us do this? And he goes, I'll only go if you go with me. And she's like, are you serious? Fine, I'll go with you. But because you're being a wimp, the piece de resistance moment, the victory of this battle is going to go to a woman. And you think that it's talking about her, but it's really talking about this woman, Jael, who finds herself like the military defeat has almost happened, but the bad guy's leader has run away and found refuge in the tent of her husband because he thinks that they're friends, but really she is an enemy because she's a friend of the Lord's. And so she lulls him to sleep with some warm milk and says, rest here. You've had a hard day warring. And he falls asleep and she drives a tent peg through his temple and kills him. So that's that story. And then Deborah gets a whole chapter of Judges where she sings a song and she celebrates the Lord's victory and she celebrates Jael. Pretty cool. Okay. Then we get Gideon. Lord help us. Gideon is such a tool. He starts out a tool, he ends a tool, but somewhere in the middle, God uses him anyway to free people from the Midianites. And Gideon is kind of wimpy and scared. And like, I feel that. You find him at the beginning of the story. He's like threshing wheat inside like a cave or a wine press. I can't remember. The point is, it's not where you would thresh wheat. Because he's scared because the Midianites they're like taking all their stuff. And so he's like in there in the sort of the dark of this tiny space trying to throw the stuff up, and there's no wind to catch the chaff. And anyway, the angel of the Lord comes to him and says, Gideon, mighty warrior. And it's a joke. It's just a total joke of a line in the Bible, because then Gideon's like, me? Like, I'm not a mighty warrior. But then we get the story that you probably heard when you were little about putting out the fleeces and testing God. And the story, maybe if you remember, about him putting together his army, and the Lord is like, this army is too big. I want the army to be nice and small so that later you will not be able to say you guys did it on your own strength. You will have to point to the fact that it was me. And so they do the thing where they go to the water, and he says, like, some people are going to cup their hands. Some people are going to put their mouth right in the stream. One of those factions send them back. And then they do a trick with pottery and lights, and they trick the Midianites, and the Midianites killed each other. And then they finish the job and they have peace in the land. And then right away, he goes back to idol worship. That fool goes right back to idol worship and like builds a Asherah pole or something. It's crazy. He's like involved in idol worship when the Lord finds him, and God asks him to like cut down this altar to a false god. And he does, but he does it at night because he's too afraid of what might happen. And at the end, he's like building a new one. Like, you watched the Lord win. Israel has peace because of you. How stupid can you be? But he was stupid. Anyway, then we get a couple names that don't say much about them, but that's because the Bible has a lot to say and very little space to say it. So Tola and Jair. And then we get to Jephthah, another one of my favorites. Y'all, I love this book of the Bible. I don't know if that was apparent yet. Jephthah, we've also talked about. He's the guy who made a vow to the Lord that the Lord never asked him to make. And sort of it showcases the fact that he had given himself over to the kind of worship they would do in the nearby tribes, where they would have to sort of make a transactional deal with their gods. Like, if, you do this for me, I'll do this for you. But as you know, this is not how our God works. God's like, I'm going to do it. You're going to be along for the ride. Right. But because he's been so involved in idol worship for so long and thinking that way, he makes this sort of transaction with the Lord where he's like, Lord, if you give me this win, which of course the Lord already told him to go in and like defeat this army. If you give me this win, the first thing I see when I get back home, I will burn alive. Like, what the heck? The Lord never asked anybody to do anything like that. It's a terrible thing to say. Now, burning people alive was something that that the Midianites and Philistines and Moabites did because their gods asked them to do terrible, terrible things. Of course, he wins the war or the battle, and he gets peace for Israel, and he gets home, and his daughter comes out of the house, and he honors his vow and he kills her. Now she gets a chance to like go with her friends into the hills and have this like final time of like lamenting that she's never going to find love and have a man and have a life. And it's terribly sad. It's just so tragic. In fact, there's an ongoing, not a festival, but some kind of a remembrance that the Jewish people still do about that girl. I can't remember her name. I'm not sure the Bible gives her a name, but that's the story of Jephthah, another loser, but the Lord uses him. Peace in Israel. Then a guy named Ibzan, then a guy named Elon, then a guy named Abdon. If y'all are looking for future baby names, highly recommend. Somewhere around here is when the Iron Age begins. And then the last judge that it talks about is Samson, who you probably heard about when you were little, if you were in churchy land. But if you haven't heard of Samson, you should read about him. He's the loser of all losers. He is not wimpy like Gideon. He's very strong because the Lord made him strong, but he disobeys the Lord left and right. He's raised under this oath where he's not supposed to do these certain things. He does them all, and he breaks all these rules, and he's super cocky. He's like a frat boy. He's big and he's strong and he knows it, and he flaunts it, and he has a problem with women. And that's where we get eventually the story of Samson and Delilah, where he tells her, about his hair, that he's never cut his hair. But the hair thing, he never cut his hair because it was a vow to the Lord that his parents made, a Nazirite vow. The hair isn't actually giving him strength. The hair is, he doesn't cut it because he's keeping that part of the vow to the Lord. It's the only thing he kept as part of that vow. And when they cut it off, his strength does go away, but it's because he has just sort of abandoned his final tether to God. And so the strength is not in his hair. The strength is from the Lord. The strength is in the spirit of the Lord that comes upon him. But, he gets enslaved and they gouge out his eyes. Yikes. And they put him to work. And then I think it's a matter of months, or I guess it would have to be many months or a couple of years later because his hair had grown back out. They pull him out for this festival with the Philistines, and they put him on display to mock him. Like, look at this guy. Remember how he was like the bane of our existence and we hated him and it was so terrible? And Samson has this final redeeming moment where he says to the Lord, I can finally make this all right. If you will give me my strength back for this one moment, I will sacrifice myself and I will take this whole building down by pushing he was in between two pillars that were holding the building up, and all the Philistine army generals and all their leadership was there. So if he did that, he would buy peace for Israel. And so the Lord gives him one last moment of strength. He pushes the pillars, the whole thing caves in, a bunch of Philistines die, and Israel has peace. So, I like this book because it's like high drama, but it is also it's a cautionary tale for us about how not to do things, right? Don't be like the judges, first of all, because for the most part, Deborah notwithstanding, and we don't have a lot of information on some of them, but the ones we do, they weren't really particularly obedient. They were just literally a tool for God to use. I don't mean a tool like a loser. I just mean God used them as a vessel for him to accomplish his purposes, despite them. But it's also a cautionary tale about the fact that when we turn away from the way that God wants us to do things, it won't go well for us. And when we do things the way that God wants us to, it will go well for us. I don't mean go well for us like Joel Osteen means. I don't mean health and wealth. I mean that we will have peace. And we all know this on a very tiny level, right? We know that if you're kind to someone, that there's a good consequence to that, right? It doesn't necessarily mean they'll always be kind back to you, but you have the peace of mind of knowing that you did the right thing. You take that and you make it on a life-size scale. And God has set out some really good rules for the people where he says things like, keep me first, love one another, don't steal from one another, don't, commit adultery, don't murder. These are good rules. If you can stick to these rules, we can have a good civilization. Okay, so we flew through the story of Joshua. We flew through the book of Judges. We are firmly in the Iron Age. And within that time that we were just talking about, now keep in mind, the time of the Judges is hundreds of years. So with each judge, it's like Israel had peace for 40 years, 20 years, 60 years, whatever. So this is a long span of time. And somewhere in that time, and we don't know exactly when, the story of Ruth happens. We've talked about the story of Ruth before, but I want to quickly retell it. And then I want us to talk about it a little bit. I'm doing this all by memory. I don't have this in front of me. So if I miss something, give me a little bit of grace because I think it'll be better than just reading through. It's four chapters in Ruth. But I am just going to pull it up in front of me just to make sure. So this happens in the time of the judges. So in the time that we were just talking about. And remember that God said that the people of Israel were not to intermarry with the other people. And we talked about the Moabites were one of the sort of bad people, the bad tribes that we weren't supposed to intermingle with. Well, there was a guy named Elimelech, and he had a wife and he had two sons, and there was famine in the land. He was actually from Bethlehem. Anybody remember anything that happens in Bethlehem later in the Bible? That's where Jesus is born. I know, I can see a couple of your faces that you do know. It's the land of bread is what it literally means, which is ironic that there was famine there, but it's also where the bread of life is born one day. And not too far removed from this story, even though it's removed by many hundreds of years. Excuse me. So there's a famine in the land, and Elimelech decides to go over to where the Moabites live and see if he can find some food for his family there. I'm not going to comment too much on whether that was a wise or an unwise choice. Part of, I listened to some people are like, he never should have gone into the Moabite kingdom. He was asking for trouble. But then I'm like, well, it was famine, he had to feed his family. So I don't know about Elimelech, but his sons should not have married Moabite women, and they did. So they married Ruth and Orpah. I think that Oprah Winfrey I heard this one time was supposed to be named Orpah from this story in the Bible, but that they misspelled it on the birth certificate when she was born. So she was born Oprah instead of Orpah. Maybe that's true, maybe it's not. But so they marry these Moabite women, and we don't know why this happens, but Elimelech, the dad, dies, and the two sons die. Not sure why. Not sure if the Bible story is trying to tell us that they died because they were disobedient, or if they just died because they died. The book of Ruth, by the way, I am 100%, I don't know, I'm gonna say certain, but I believe the book of Ruth happened. There's really not a lot of people that say it didn't happen. This is a historical event, but it is told in a very like narrative storytelling fashion. And the whole thing is told in chiasm. I've used that word before. Chiasm is like an X. And Esther is also told in chiasm. There's parts of different Psalms and different stories in the Bible that are, all it means is that there's a crux center moment. And from that, coming out from it, are like parallel things that are told similarly. Sometimes they'll even have like parallel linguistics. And so sometimes it'll say something that's like pointing to the problem, and then the climax happens, and then it's pointing away, to the sort of denouement of the story. We're going to be discussing that in our discussion questions. One of the areas where it's Naomi says something at the front end of the story, and in the exact same verses, in the mirror part of the backstory, she says the exact opposite thing. She has a complicated relationship with the Lord, and I feel that right now. So I'm very much resonating with Naomi in this story. But okay, so we've got this family. They've gone to Moab. They've taken Moabite women. The men all die. So now we have Naomi, who's an Israelite, left with her two daughters-in-law that are Moabite women. And they're all in a bad way, because you guys know by now, if you've been listening to me, that widows, women without a man in this day and age did not do well. They needed the man for financial security and to work the land and provide for them, and provide inheritance for their sons and onwards. So they were a mess. Well, they hear that there's food in Bethlehem again, that the famine is starting to go away. And so Naomi decides to go back to Bethlehem, and they follow her for a bit. And she says during the journey to them, you guys, you're so sweet. You don't need to follow me back to Bethlehem. You are free from me. Like, my sons are no longer with you. And it's not like I could provide for you again. Even if I meet somebody now and get married and have a baby, what are you going to do? Wait till the baby grows up? Like, no, we're not doing that. Like, you're young, you can go find love again. Stay here. I'm going back to Bethlehem. Blessings, right? And Orpah's like, good point. And so she goes back to her hometown, and no judgment there. But Ruth does this funny thing where she says, no, I want to stay with you. And you guys have heard of me making fun of people for this before, that people use this in their weddings, because it's really not a wedding verse. I'm looking for it now, but Ruth says this very meaningful thing, which maybe you've heard, where she says, no, where you go, I'm going to go. Where you live, I'll live. Your God will be my God, and your people will be my people. I think that's what it says. Again, I didn't pull it up, but, and so Ruth is basically saying, I want to hitch my wagon to you. And it's interesting because there's no reason for her to do that, except, and I'm reading into the story, but I think the story invites us to read this into it. I think that Ruth knows that there is something about the Israelite God that she wants a part of. And so she's going to follow Naomi back to that way of doing things. Okay, so they return to Bethlehem. And when they get back, some of the people recognize Naomi. Naomi, is that you? Oh my gosh, how are you? Whatever. And Naomi says, don't call me Naomi anymore. Call me Mara. And Mara means bitter. It harkens back to a story with Moses in the desert. She says, because the Lord abandoned me, and he hates me. And we're going to talk about this in our discussion. And so I'm bitter now. So call me bitter. And so like, okay. Anyway, so they kind of set up camp, and Ruth decides, or Naomi and Ruth decide, they're going to just go do whatever they can for work and food. And Ruth says she's going to go out to some of the fields of the area and see if she can glean. I'm going to tell you what that is in a second, from the edge of the fields, to see if they can just scrape together some food. Interestingly enough, the Bible has set up in Deuteronomy and Leviticus a law. Remember all those laws that people don't want to obey? God set up a law such that people that had farmland would that they would keep the margins and the edge of the farmland like harvested or unmessed with, so that beggars, poor people, widows, the sick, the oppressed, the marginalized could come along and take some of the stuff from the edges of the farm. Now, Ruth doesn't know that because she's not an Israelite. So there's kind of a cool section where she goes, I'm just going to go out and see if there's any extra things that we can find. Little does she know, oh, the Israelite God has actually worked that into the system. So she just happens upon the field of a guy named Boaz, and she gleans. Gleaning is taking the wheat or barley or grain, and I think that actually might be barley in the story. Again, I'm doing this from memory. From the edges of the field, and they're like allowed to do it. But still, it was kind of dangerous because the workers out in the field were guys. They weren't always honorable, respectable men. If they see women gleaning at the edge of the field and it's far away from like town, that could be a dangerous space, right? So Boaz notices her out in the field, and word has gotten to him of what she's done as far as like staying with her mother-in-law and being this sort of loyal, noble person. And so he says, like, because of that, God's going to reward you and show you favor, and keep gleaning from my fields. I'm going to tell my men to like pause off, leave you alone. And he does. And he even tells them to leave her extra, like put some stalks behind you as you go so that there will be plenty for her. Of course, she comes home. She has all this food. Naomi's like, oh, what happened? Where's this from? I'm skipping through this quickly because I want to get to our questions, but she tells her, and then Naomi's like, wait, Boaz? For real? Boaz is actually our kin. Like, he's some distant cousin. And per Levitical law and the way that it worked, if you guys remember the whole, like, if the husband dies, the brother will marry the wife, not for like naughty stuff, but just to keep her secure in finances and all that jazz. And so that same thing applied to like close relatives. So Ruth's husband didn't have a brother, but apparently he had like a distant cousin, and it was Boaz. What? She just happened to be in his field. Crazy. So after some time passes, Naomi says, you know what you should do? And she lays out this insane plan, which is descriptive, not prescriptive. This is not how we should go find men. But she's supposed to go to the barn where they do all the threshing during the harvesting. And she's supposed to wait until the men have like done what they're going to do as far as the threshing, and they've eaten and they've had a fair amount to drink, because it's during the time of harvest, which meant this was a happy time. And it was a time of a lot of beer, probably being drunk. And so she says, make a note of where he like lays his head. And then in like the dark of night, go over there and uncover his feet. Weird. And lay down next to him. And Ruth, because she is this like dutiful, loyal, trusting woman, and she kind of does have the hots for Boaz, does it. So she does this kind of risky, strange thing. And she goes in there and all the stuff that I just said. And in the dark of night, he's snoring away on his, I don't know, 6 beers or whatever. She uncovers the blanket down by his feet and lays next to him. Now, that could mean various things. Feet in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament, can have a sexual symbolic undertone. So some people think that she like was naughty with him. I don't think she was, because every other part of the story indicates that both of them are very honorable, play it by the rules, rule book people, even his response afterwards. So I don't think it was naughty. I actually think her laying down there and then what she says to him afterwards is an indication that she is wanting him to take care of her and sort of be the leader in their new family. And she's actually going to propose to him, because he wakes up in the middle of the night and he's sort of alarmed to see this woman down there. And he's like, who is that? And she says, it's Ruth. Will you put the corner of your garment over me? And she doesn't mean share the covers, I'm cold. She means, will you provide for me? And the corner of the garment, y'all have heard me talk about this before, and I don't want to spend too much time on it, but it has all kinds of deep significance in the Bible, because men's garments, it wasn't like us where we pick a new outfit every day. It probably had like the tassels on it with all of the different tassels for the law in Leviticus. It was a symbol of protection and provision to be under the corner of someone's garment. It's why the story of the woman that touches Jesus, the hem of his garment, that there's just this rich significance of, I want to be surrendered to you. I want to be under your lordship. And so lordship, not the same way with Ruth and Boaz, right? Because it's more of a love story, but she wants him to take care of her. And so she essentially proposes to him and he says, okay. But there is somebody else in Bethlehem who's a closer relative to her than Boaz. So he says, I got to take care of this business first. And honestly, I have to ask him first if he wants to marry you and bring you into his family because he gets like first dibs. And so he goes to the city gate where they conduct business and he calls these people together. And Boaz is really well respected. You can tell by the fact that these people just like stop what they're doing and sit down and have this kind of impromptu legal ceremony where this other guy comes along. The guy doesn't even have a name in the Bible. It doesn't give him a name. By the way, this whole story is told from the perspective of and engineered by women. It's very cool. And it's a whole book of the Bible, right? Like, I don't know. I think that's very cool. It's not the way that you would expect, given the way that women were thought of at this time. So he asked this other guy, Joe Schmo, like, you're a closer kinsman. The word that's used in the Bible is kinsman redeemer. Kinsman means, well, kin, like related, and redeemer means because they're related, he can redeem, not like saving, like the way God saves us, though the symbolism is not lost on us, but can redeem by like marrying that person and then providing for them, and then they'll be part of the inheritance. They're redeemed. They're sort of taken in and saved financially, right? So the other kinsman redeemer is like, oh yeah, I could get down with that. Oh wait, I have to marry this woman and maybe give her children, and then those people will be part of my inheritance along with my own family. Nah, I'm not going to do that. I don't want to do that. I don't want to have that extra like burden. You can have her. And so they have this whole weird exchange where one gives the other one a sandal. I don't want to get into that. It's very strange, but it's a way of saying we're like, with these witnesses, we're doing this thing. And then Boaz marries Ruth and they have a baby. And the baby is 2 steps removed from King David, who we will be talking about next time. And the end of the book explains that Obed is the father of Jesse. Jesse is the father of David. There is a passage in the Bible that talks about Jesus being from the root of Jesse because Jesus comes from this line. In fact, when you go to the book of Matthew, the part at the beginning that's kind of boring to read, the genealogy, lists several women in it, including all of these like unlikely characters. It includes Rahab. We talked about her earlier. It includes Bathsheba, who we'll talk about next time, who was kind of an outsider, was pulled into a really yucky scheme with King David. It includes Tamar, who we talked about last time, I think. Judah and Tamar, remember, she dresses up like a prostitute to trick her former father-in-law into giving her a child because he was like abdicating his duty. And of course, then it includes Ruth, the Moabitess. She's not who would be a likely grandmother of Jesus. And yet Jesus chose her. And he chose her because he chooses who he wants. But there is something about her character that's displayed in this book that I think, we can read into why he might have chosen her. Anyway, that is the story. I have done this as quickly as I possibly can. We are going to have some discussion questions about the book of Ruth. And I want to just say one of them quickly before I stop the recording. So if anybody is watching on YouTube, I do think this is interesting. It's not the first one we're going to do, but we are going to examine 2 passages that fall into that chiasm structure that I was talking about. It's in Ruth 1 and then Ruth 2. Both of them, it's verses 19 to 21. The first 19 to 21 says this. So the 2 women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" "Don't call me Naomi," she told them. "Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty." Interesting choice of words. "Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." Fast forward, you know the story now because I just told you. So in Ruth 2, when she's starting to realize that Boaz is showing favor and he's their kin and like things might be looking up, the exact same numbered verses, 19 to 21, it says, her mother-in-law asked her, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." And then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. "The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz," she said. "The Lord bless him," Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. "He, the Lord, has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead. She added, that man is our close relative. He is one of our kinsmen or guardian redeemers. Her tune changes, right? And I don't think that she's like a whole different person. I think that she is responding to two very different things, which we can, resonate with. Sometimes it feels like the Lord has brought affliction. Doesn't mean the Lord did it, but that's how it feels. And then things go well and you're like, the Lord loves us. We're going to be talking about that, but I just want to leave that as something to noodle on for those that are watching the video later. But since I don't want all of your personal thoughts going into YouTube, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. Bye, YouTube people. If I can remember how.